At my sister's wedding, she raised the microphone and laughed as 200 guests stared at me. 31 unmarried useless, she called me, and the room chuckled. My parents stayed silent. My cheeks burned, but none of them knew the truth. I was the woman who once saved her groom's empire, the one holding a secret that could shatter their perfect night. The chandeliers in the ballroom of the Waldorf Grand glowed like captured stars, their light shimmering across marble floors, polished to perfection. My heels clicked in measured steps as I crossed the threshold, trying to quiet the restless pulse in my chest. 200 guests filled the air with laughter, and the clinking of glasses, gowns sweeping past tuxedos, the kind of scene my parents had always dreamed for Rachel. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress, a choice I had thought elegant, but now felt invisible against the glitz of sequins and silk. My parents were stationed near the champagne fountain, their smiles fixed in place like porcelain masks. My mother's diamond earrings caught the light as she leaned in to kiss an old family friend on both cheeks, not once glancing in my direction. My father stood tall with his habitual posture of authority, one hand gripping the shoulder of a colleague, his voice booming over the din of the room. When his eyes skimmed the crowd, they brushed past me as if I were a stranger who had slipped in by accident. I drew in a slow breath, reminding myself that I was used to this, used to being unseen. I found a spot near the back, beside a towering arrangement of lilies that did little to mask the scent of expensive perfume and champagne. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched the stem of my glass, my reflection blurred in the bubbles that rose to the surface. I told myself to endure, to blend, to let the evening pass without incident. But Rachel never allowed silence to speak when humiliation could be louder. She appeared at the center of the room, like a queen stepping into her coronation. The ivory gown hugged her frame beads on the veil, scattering the light into 1,000 points that seemed to bend toward her. She accepted the microphone from the bandleader with a smile that had always been both dazzling and dangerous. The music softened and then stopped altogether as her voice carried sweet at first, thanking the guests for sharing her joy, praising the union of two families. Polite applause rose and faded, and then her eyes locked on me. My stomach tightened. I felt the shift in the air before her words landed. "This is my sister," she said with a brightness that cut sharper than steel. 31 years old, still on her own, still waiting for someone to notice her. The sentence hung heavy in the golden air, every syllable deliberate, a performance crafted to draw blood without leaving a mark. A ripple of laughter traveled through the crowd, nervous at first, and then crueler when no one stopped it. Someone near the dessert table muttered something that drew another chuckle. My mother lowered her eyes and adjusted the clasp of her purse. My father tugged at his cufflinks with practiced detachment, his face arranged into a look of mild boredom, as though he had not heard at all. They refused to meet my gaze, refused to offer even a glance that might have told me I was not alone. Heat surged to my face, a fire that burned up my throat and pressed against my eyes. I gripped the glass in my hand until the stem threatened to snap. Whispers swelled, silk rustled. A man near the bar shook his head with something between pity and amusement. The quartet had fallen silent, their bows poised in midair, and the hush in the room pressed against me like a wall. I wanted to move to flee, but my body would not obey. My chest tightened, my legs locked. Shame flooded every corner of me so strong it left me numb. Rachel lifted her chin triumphant in the silence she had manufactured. Her smile widened, basking in the attention, the applause that never came. I could see the triumph in her eyes, the same look she had worn since childhood, whenever she managed to push me out of the light. I tried to draw breath to remind myself that I had survived worse, but the weight of 200 eyes held me captive. I shifted my gaze, desperate for an anchor, and found him. David stood by the head table, one hand resting on the back of his chair, his expression carved from stone. His eyes fixed on me, unwavering, pulling me out of the suffocating fog. His jaw tightened, the line of his shoulders rigid. The guests nearest him began to sense it too, their laughter trailing off, their whispers thinning into silence. The tension sharpened, stretching across the ballroom like a wire drawn too tight. In that suspended moment, everything stilled. The sting of Rachel's words, the indifference of my parents, The judgment of strangers all collapsed into a single point, where David's stare held mine. The room seemed to wait breath, caught for what he might do next. I could not hold his stare for long, so I looked down at the champagne in my hand, the bubbles rising and breaking just like the panic inside me. The silence in the ballroom pressed against my skin, and for a fleeting moment, I was no longer 31 years old in Manhattan. I was 16 again, standing in the kitchen of our small house in Boston, with the smell of my father's coffee still in the air and my mother fussing over Rachel's dress for the winter formal. Rachel twirled in front of the hallway mirror, the hem of her new gown brushing against polished shoes that cost more than my entire outfit. My mother clapped her hands with delight, calling her beautiful, saying she looked like a movie star. I had asked weeks before for help buying a simple second-hand dress for the debate banquet at school. My request was brushed aside, my father telling me there were better uses for money than for me to play at being important. I ended up wearing a skirt from the thrift store and doing extra shifts at the diner to cover the ticket. By the time I was 16, working was as much a part of me as school. I folded napkins and cleared tables at that diner until midnight, then dragged myself into class the next morning with heavy eyes. The tips I earned went into a jar hidden under my bed. That jar was the only way I could pay for my books and save for college, because while Rachel's tuition fund was discussed at the dinner table, mine was never mentioned. My father insisted Rachel had potential worth investing in, while for me he said hard work was its own reward. He was a man who valued appearances more than substance. He would praise Rachel for her charm, for the way she smiled at adults and made them feel important. He never praised me for the nights I spent studying or the fact that I brought home straight A's. He would shake his head and say grades were expected, not celebrated. My mother would soften the edges of his words, brushing my shoulder gently and telling me not to take it personally, that he was only hard on me because I was strong enough to handle it. Then she would turn and gush over Rachel's latest selfie or her plan to try out for cheerleading. It was always the same pattern. Rachel's missteps were forgiven, my mistakes magnified. If she came home late, my mother said the bus must have been delayed. If I missed curfew by 5 minutes, my father was waiting in the living room, voice sharp, asking what kind of example I thought I was setting. When Rachel got into a fender bender with my father's car, he called it a lesson and handed her the keys again the next week. When I scuffed my sneakers working at the diner, he told me I looked careless and that no one respected a girl who did not take care of herself. The only place I found refuge was in my grandmother's living room. Eleanor Price smelled of lavender and old books, her shelves lined with novels and poetry. She would pour me tea, place her frail hand over mine, and listen. Truly listen, in a way no one else did. She told me that value was not given by people who could not see it, that worth was something you carried even when others denied it. She was the only one who celebrated the scholarship essay I wrote, the only one who came to my art show at the community center when my parents were too busy taking Rachel to a salon appointment. I remember the sound of her laugh, low and warm, when she told me I would surprise them all one day. That my strength was not in pretending to be perfect for a crowd, but in surviving when no one clapped. Those words sank into me deeper than anything my parents ever said. When she passed away in the fall of 2022, I felt the floor of my world shift. I stood at her graveside in Cambridge, with the cold wind cutting through my coat, watching the last person who had truly believed in me being lowered into the earth. I thought I had lost her forever, until the lawyer read her will. She had left me a trust, $500,000, designated for scholarships and programs in my name. It was not about the money itself. It was the message that she had chosen me, that she believed I would use it to open doors, not for myself alone, but for others who felt invisible. I never told my parents the full amount. To them, I said she left a modest sum to help with my career. They nodded, unimpressed, then turned the conversation back to Rachel's growing social media following. They never asked how I used the inheritance. They never cared to know that it became the foundation of something bigger than myself, something I was still building in secret. As the memory of that day in Boston faded, I returned to the present with Rachel's laughter echoing in my ears. The crowd at the wedding still buzzed faintly, waiting for David to move, for me to break, for something to happen that would release the tension choking the air. My grandmother's voice lingered inside me like a thread of steel, reminding me that value was not something Rachel or my parents could strip away with a microphone and a cruel smile. The ballroom seemed suspended on the edge of a blade, and I could feel the weight of every eye pressing down, demanding the next moment. I thought of the office back in Newark, the steady rhythm of my days where I managed product campaigns and presented quarterly reports, the small victories of seeing a project through from draft to billboard. It was not glamorous work, but it was mine, the career I had built, without a dime of my parents' help. At the marketing firm, I was known for meeting deadlines, for finding ways to make pharmaceutical ads feel human, for keeping my team together when stress threatened to split us apart. Still, every family dinner ended with my father calling it just a job, and my mother sighing that I had settled too low. I learned to stop telling them about promotions or about the new clients I landed. To them, being on a payroll meant being ordinary, while Rachel's curated photos on social media were celebrated as though she had climbed Everest. I kept my head down and reminded myself that the paycheck paid for my apartment, my car, my independence. Ordinary was survival, and survival was more than they had ever given me credit for. Yet even in the quiet of my own apartment there were nights when my reflection felt dimmer than it should. Trevor Scott had once been part of that story. He was a software engineer I had met during a networking event in Jersey City. He had an easy smile and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see through everyone else's small talk. For a while, I thought he saw me too. We dated for nearly a year, dinners and Hoboken weekends spent walking along the waterfront. It ended one night over takeout containers and an unfinished bottle of wine. He told me I lacked ambition. He wanted someone who dreamed bigger, who would chase success until it bent to their will. To him, my satisfaction with a steady career and modest goals looked like complacency. I remember setting down my fork, feeling my chest go hollow, as he said he could not build a future with someone who did not want more. The wound lingered long after he walked out of my apartment. It was not just the loss of him, but the echo of my father's words in his mouth. Poor choices. Wasted potential. Hearing it from someone who had once called me enough made it harder to breathe. I buried myself in work after that, polishing every campaign, accepting every late assignment, telling myself that one day no one would dare call me small. That determination was what carried me through the year 2021, the year I met David Miller, most unexpectedly. He was not Rachel's fiancé then. He was a real estate developer, facing a lawsuit that could have gutted his company. I had been introduced to him through Anna Lopez, a civil attorney I knew from college. Anna had taken on his case, and she asked if I would consult on the marketing fallout while she managed the courtroom. I spent long nights reviewing press releases and drafting strategies, making sure his investors did not pull out. I sat in meetings where his future seemed to dangle by a thread, where I watched him fight with quiet resolve as Anna dismantled the plaintiff's claims piece by piece. By the time the verdict came down, David had not only saved his company, but secured a judgment worth $5 million. He thanked me privately afterward, telling me that my calm under pressure had steadied him when he was close to breaking. I never told my parents about my role in that case. They would have dismissed it as luck or a coincidence. To this day, Rachel still does not know that I was ever part of David's story before she slipped an engagement ring onto her finger. It was a secret I carried with me into that ballroom, a truth that sat quietly beneath the weight of Rachel's mockery. As the guests leaned in to watch, as whispers twisted through the silence, I remembered the nights I had helped David guard his reputation, and the relief on his face when the jury sided with him. The same man now stood across the room, his eyes fixed on me, his shoulders squared as though he was ready to speak into the suffocating quiet. The memory of his stare dragged me backward to the week before, to the dinner my parents insisted on hosting at a private dining room in a Beacon Hill restaurant. The table stretched long and narrow, gleaming with polished silverware and wine glasses, the kind of formality my mother loved. I had dressed carefully that night, navy blouse tucked into tailored pants, a folder in my bag, with the letter of promotion I had received from the firm. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would finally be a piece of news they would be proud to hear. The evening began with the usual rehearsed pleasantries. My father stood at the head of the table, introducing Rachel to each guest as if she were royalty. He boasted about the Waldorf Grand, about the string quartet, about the menu designed by a Michelin chef. My mother chimed in with details about the guest list, the designer who had flown from Paris to fit Rachel's gown, the celebrity hairstylist who had been booked for the morning of the wedding. Their voices flowed around me like waves, each sentence pushing me further from shore. I waited for a pause for an opening to mention my own accomplishment. When the plates of seared salmon were placed before us, I cleared my throat. I wanted to tell them about the new campaign I would be leading, about the responsibility my managers had finally entrusted me with, proof that I was more than a placeholder at a desk. But my words never reached the surface. A neighbor leaned forward with a smile, asking about the floral arrangements for the ballroom, and my mother leapt at the chance to describe orchids imported from Singapore. My father poured another round of wine and toasted to Rachel, his voice filling the room with pride that had never been directed my way. I set my fork down, appetite gone, the letter of promotion burning against the leather of my bag. Rachel basked in the glow like it was sunlight made just for her. Every laugh at her jokes, every compliment about her ring seemed to stretch her taller. She did not glance at me once, and when she did speak my name, it was to remark that she hoped I would find someone soon, that perhaps this wedding would inspire me. The table laughed politely. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile, the same tired mask I had worn since childhood. Later, when the plates were cleared and coffee was served, I excused myself to the restroom. My reflection in the mirror stared back at me, eyes too bright with unshed tears. I leaned on the counter, breathing through the ache in my chest, reminding myself I was 31 years old, not the little girl sitting alone at the school play, while my parents cheered for Rachel. The old wound still bled when pressed. Outside the door, Michael Brooks was waiting. He had been my friend since college, a reporter with an instinct for truths others tried to bury. He studied my face for a moment before speaking. "You do not have to let them do this to you." His tone was gentle but firm. I shook my head, laughing softly without humor. "It is easier to stay quiet. If I argue, it only proves their point." "No," he said, resting his hand briefly on my shoulder. "Silence only tells them they are right. You have a life they know nothing about, and you do not owe them smallness to keep their comfort." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to walk back into that dining room and speak about the promotion, about the clients who trusted me, about the nights I stayed late to prove my worth. But the thought of their dismissive glances and polite nods silenced me again. The dinner ended as it always did, with my parents glowing from Rachel's success and me fading into the wallpaper. On the sidewalk outside, the cold Boston air bit against my skin as guests climbed into waiting cars. Rachel disappeared into a limousine with her fiancé, laughter trailing behind her like perfume. My parents waved them off, then turned to me only to remind me not to forget my dress for the ceremony. Michael walked beside me toward the subway. "You are going to that wedding," he said quietly. "Do not hide. Stand there, look them all in the eye, and let the truth of who you are speak louder than their lies." I looked at him, searching for a reason to refuse, but his conviction left no space for retreat. I nodded, the weight of the decision settling heavy in my chest. I knew what awaited me, the same sharp words, the same stage built for Rachel's glory. But for the first time, I felt something stir beneath the shame, a flicker of resolve that maybe it was time to stop shrinking. The night ended with me lying awake in my apartment, the letter of promotion unfolded on the nightstand, the city lights washing through the blinds. I stared at the words on the page, proof of a life my family refused to see, and promised myself I would not run from the wedding. Even if I walked into the fire, I would face it head on. And so when the day came, I dressed in silence, my heart steady with the choice I had made. What I could not know was how quickly the fire would spread once Rachel put the microphone in her hand. Rachel's voice rang clear over the hum of the crowd, cutting through the clink of silverware and the soft chatter, as if the entire ballroom existed only to hear her. She tightened her grip on the microphone, her smile wide, and polished her words aimed like arrows. "Some people come to a wedding to celebrate love," she said sweetly, and then her gaze swept to me like a spotlight. "Others come because they have nothing else to do." 31 years old, no husband, no family of her own, and here she is, just here for the free champagne. Laughter rippled through the guests, awkward at first, then louder when no one interrupted her. I felt the sting of every word across my skin, the burn crawling up my neck. Phones were lifted in the air, glowing screens catching my humiliation from every angle. A man near the bar lifted his camera higher and began to live stream. I caught the words on his screen as he typed Carter family wedding drama. Hundreds, maybe thousands, would soon watch me stripped bare in real time. My chest clenched, but I forced myself to stay upright. The chandeliers blurred as my vision swam. I could hear the low buzz of whispers, the tilt of judgment hanging in every eye. It was a courtroom without walls, a jury of strangers ready to convict me of worthlessness. My mother folded her napkin slowly, eyes fixed on her lap. My father raised his glass as if he were fascinated by the bubbles, his silence louder than Rachel's taunts. Not a word of defense, not even a glance to remind me I belonged. Rachel tilted her head, basking in the applause of those who thought cruelty was charm. She added another barb, saying, "Maybe one day I would figure out how to be somebody. But until then, at least I could take home a centerpiece from the tables, a little consolation prize for my empty life." The crowd gasped, then half laughed, the mix of disbelief and morbid entertainment. My throat tightened, every breath shallow. I wanted to shout, to throw the glass in my hand against the floor, to demand they all see me as more than her punchline. Instead, I stood frozen, a statue carved from shame. The music had long since stopped. Even the waitstaff lingered at the edges, watching with uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or continue pouring wine. The ballroom air thickened, buzzing with the static of 200 unspoken verdicts. My legs trembled, but I locked my knees and clenched my jaw, refusing to collapse in front of them. It was then that the sound of glass meeting wood broke the tension. Sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. David placed his champagne flute down on the head table, the stem ringing briefly against the polished surface. The motion was simple, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Conversations faltered. Phones lowered. The laughter died mid-breath. I looked toward him, my pulse loud in my ears. His posture was rigid, his hand still resting against the rim of the glass. His gaze swept the crowd before returning to me, steady and unflinching. The silence in the ballroom shifted from mockery to anticipation, as if every guest knew something irreversible was about to unfold. Rachel's smile froze, the brightness faltering for the first time all night. She turned her head slightly toward David, confusion flickering across her face, but he did not look at her. His attention remained fixed, his presence cutting through the suffocating haze that surrounded me. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the words that had yet to come. David rose from his chair with a calmness that was more chilling than any outburst. His eyes did not leave mine as his voice carried clearly across the ballroom. "If it were not for Emily Carter, my company would have been destroyed in 2021. Every head turned, the crowd shifting like a tide pulled by the moon. He continued steady and deliberate. "She was the one who connected me to the attorney who dismantled the case against us. She guided our messaging, stood firm when investors threatened to walk, and because of her, we won that case. We secured a $5 million judgment." A gasp rolled through the guests like thunder echoing off marble walls. Phones that had been raised to mock now trembled with the weight of a new story. The name Carter no longer belonged only to the bride, but to me standing alone at the back with every light suddenly burning brighter. Rachel's painted smile cracked. "That is not true," she said quickly, her voice pitched higher than usual. She tried to laugh, but it rang hollow. "My sister had nothing to do with that case. She does not even know the first thing about business." The guests murmured, eyes darting between her and David. He turned his gaze on her, then finally sharp as a blade. "I sat in those meetings. I watched her put out fires that would have sunk me. I watched her keep her composure when half a dozen men twice her age dismissed her. Without her, I would not be standing here, and there would be no company to invest in." The weight of his words pressed down on Rachel like a hand around her throat. She shook her head, stammering that he was exaggerating, that I must have said something to make myself look good. But the screens that had been raised earlier now worked against her. The same guests who had broadcast my humiliation were now recording her panic, their cameras unblinking. One man near the bar replayed his live stream aloud, his phone catching her cruel words about me minutes earlier. The sound echoed in the hush. Empty life. Free champagne. The guests listened again this time, with eyes no longer amused, but sharp with judgment. My father cleared his throat, but said nothing. My mother twisted the stem of her glass until her knuckles whitened. No defense came for Rachel this time. David looked back at me, and his voice dropped into something heavier, something final. I cannot allow my future wife to humiliate the very person who once saved me. If respect is absent here, then what kind of foundation do we think we are standing on? The ballroom froze. The chandeliers gleamed like frozen constellations, every crystal reflecting the tension that had settled thick in the air. I could feel 200 sets of eyes resting on me, no longer with mockery, but with something closer to awe and disbelief. The silence stretched brittle and waiting to shatter. The room erupted all at once, voices rising in a storm of disbelief and curiosity. Guests leaned across tables to whisper, some shielding their mouths, as though secrecy could mask the frenzy. A few shook their heads and stood gathering their coats, unwilling to stay in the wreckage of a wedding that had just cracked open. The scrape of chairs echoed as clusters of people quietly slipped out, leaving half-filled glasses and unfinished plates behind them. Rachel's face was drained of its glow, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone. She tried to speak, but her voice broke into jagged fragments. "This is ridiculous," she stammered, forcing a laugh that came out brittle. "David is confused. He must have misunderstood." She turned toward my parents, her eyes wide with desperation. "Tell them," she pleaded. "Tell them Emily had nothing to do with it." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again, the practiced elegance slipping from her features. My father cleared his throat, but no words came. The two of them sat frozen, their postures stiff, their authority useless in the face of the chaos. They looked like people who had spent their entire lives staging a performance only to realize the curtain had been pulled back. Rachel's voice rose harsh and panicked. "She has always been jealous," she said, pointing at me with a manicured finger. "That is what this is. She has been waiting for a moment to ruin my day." But the guests no longer looked entertained. They stared at her with the cool disapproval reserved for someone exposed, their silence speaking louder than any protest. My phone buzzed against the clutch in my hand. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Michael Brooks. Already online, he wrote, "Video has 2,000 views in 10 minutes. I lifted my eyes and saw him across the room, phone in hand, his jaw set. He gave me a small nod, the kind that told me he was making sure the world saw what had really happened. The buzz in the room shifted as more phones lit up. Guests scrolled, eyes widening as the clip spread from one device to the next. I caught fragments of the words being replayed. Rachel's voice, loud and cruel. My humiliation now a piece of evidence replayed with captions. A woman in a sequined dress whispered that it was already on Twitter. Another muttered that it was trending under the Waldorf Grand tag. Rachel's fiancé stood rigid at her side, his jaw tight. He said nothing, his silence more damning than any accusation. Rachel tried again to recover her tone, sugary sweet, but it cracked at the edges. People were not listening anymore. They were recording. I felt a calmness settle into me that I had never known in all the years of being diminished. The shame that had crushed me minutes earlier lifted, replaced by a clarity that this moment was no longer mine to carry alone. The truth had taken on a life of its own, spreading faster than Rachel's lies could chase. I placed my glass on the nearest table, the stem steady between my fingers. My steps were deliberate as I moved toward the exit, each one pulling me away from the stifling heat of the ballroom. Heads turned as I passed, but the weight of their eyes no longer burned. The music had not resumed. The only sound was the hum of voices and the quiet tremor of my heels against marble. At the doors, I paused, glancing back once. Rachel stood rigid in her gown, her mouth moving in frantic protest, but the words dissolved under the heavy silence of disbelieving guests. My parents looked smaller than I had ever seen them, stripped of the authority they had always wielded over me. David remained at the head table, his eyes still fixed on me, unwavering. The night air met me like a baptism when I stepped outside. The city stretched out in glittering towers and restless traffic alive in a way that felt both harsh and forgiving. I drew in a breath that filled my lungs completely, the kind of breath I could never take under their roof. My phone buzzed again, Michael sending another update. 20,000 views now. Comments are brutal. I slipped the phone back into my clutch without answering. I did not need to read the comments to know what they said. I had seen the truth in the eyes of the guests as I left. The scales had shifted, and for once they did not tip against me. As I walked down the steps of the Waldorf Grand, the weight on my shoulders loosened. My grandmother's words whispered through me that worth was not given by those who could not see it. I felt them now more than ever, as though her voice was carried in the night air. And deep inside I knew this was only the beginning of something much larger than that ballroom. The headlines appeared the next morning before I had even made coffee. Carter wedding scandal, one article read, with a still image of Rachel pointing her manicured finger at me, while the caption quoted her cruelest words. Another headline called it a meltdown at the Waldorf Grand. My phone buzzed nonstop with links and messages, some from colleagues at the firm, some from people I had not spoken to since high school. The video had spread across every platform, replayed millions of times. Rachel tried to do damage control with her usual charm, but the clips were too clear, her words too sharp to spin into anything else. Brands that had once courted her for endorsements distanced themselves overnight. Comment sections filled with anger, strangers calling her entitled, spoiled, unkind. The shine that she had cultivated for years dulled in a matter of hours. My parents were dragged into it too. The community in Boston that once admired their polished image now whispered about how they had raised one daughter to sparkle while silencing the other. My father's old law colleagues avoided his calls. My mother shut her boutique for a week under the excuse of renovations, though everyone knew she could not face the stairs. I returned to Newark, quietly sliding back into my office at the firm. To my surprise, my team treated me no differently. A few offered quiet congratulations, one slipped a note onto my desk that said, "Proud of you." I buried myself in the new campaign, long hours that grounded me after the chaos. At night, I worked on the scholarship fund my grandmother had left me, setting up partnerships with local schools in her name. Each meeting with a principal, each letter from a student, reminded me that Eleanor's faith in me lived on in every opportunity I could give away. Rachel called once, her number flashing on my screen late in the evening. I let it ring until it went silent. When she tried again, I picked up more out of curiosity than obligation. Her voice was hoarse, softer than I remembered. She said she had lost sponsors, that people treated her differently, that David barely spoke to her. I listened but said little. She wanted sympathy, but I had none left to offer. The silence between us stretched until she muttered that I had ruined everything and hung up. I stared at the phone long after the line went dead, realizing she still could not see that it had been her own hand that struck the match. David reached out a week later. His message was brief, asking if I would meet for coffee in the city. I agreed, curiosity outweighing hesitation. At the cafe on Lexington Avenue, he arrived without Rachel, his suit crisp, his expression tired. He thanked me again, not for saving his company this time, but for not shrinking when she tried to cut me down. He said he needed time to consider what kind of marriage he had been walking into. I nodded, knowing it was not my place to guide his decision, only his to make. As weeks passed, the noise faded, but the shift remained. My family could not repair what had been exposed. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. I learned to measure worth, not in their silence or in Rachel's jealousy, but in the lives I touched quietly through work and through the fund my grandmother entrusted me with. One evening, I visited Eleanor's grave in Cambridge. The leaves had begun to turn orange and red against the autumn sky. I laid fresh flowers at the stone and whispered that her faith had not been wasted. I told her about the first student who would receive a scholarship in her name, a girl who wanted to study literature, but whose parents said it was impractical. I smiled at the irony and felt the wind shift, carrying the scent of fallen leaves, as if it were her answer. Standing there, I realized the humiliation that had once pressed me into silence had become the spark that freed me. That night in Manhattan had not destroyed me. It had revealed me, and the truth had spoken louder than I ever could. If you had been in my place, if the people closest to you had tried to strip you bare in front of the world, would you have bowed your head, or would you have trusted the truth to rise and defend itself?